First of all, thank you very much for coming. And again, thank you to the team at the UK column for helping to produce this event. We've also been here for a couple of days, my colleagues and fellow speakers here, Tim Norman and Craig Murray, familiarizing ourselves with Salisbury and with the story and retracing the steps of some of the key actors in this story. And I can say for all of us, it was very, very illuminating. And we're also going to be sharing some of those insights with you tonight. I'm Patrick Henningsen. If you don't know me, I am a journalist and the founder of 21stCenturyWire.com. I'm also the co-anchor at the UK Column News, which is a UK independent media outlet, many of you know. And I was covering this Skripal story when it broke in 2018, and I became very interested because of the parallels it had with similar stories that I had also covered at that time and before that, in Syria, for instance, chemical weapons attacks and so forth. So that's my main interest in this particular theme, this story, and I'll share some of those views and insights with you tonight as well. But let me introduce my colleagues. Tim Norman is an independent journalist. He is also an experienced journalist, by the way. He's worked in the field for many years. And well, I'll let him tell his story. But he's taken a very keen interest in this story over the last few years. And I think, and very passionate about getting closer to the truth. And that's all we really want to do. Craig Murray, former British ambassador to Uzbekistan, veteran of the Foreign Office, who's also a historian, an author, and in my opinion, and probably some of yours as well, one of the most consequential independent journalists active right now in this country and even further afield. So welcome to our speakers, Tim, Craig, ladies and gentlemen, thank you. And let me just say, first off, let me set the stage. What we're going to talk about tonight is the longest running criminal investigation in British history. But incredibly, there has been no evidence signed off by a judge. It has not been tested in court. The findings have not been made public through the normal due process. So from that perspective, this is a really incredible story and incredible situation. And as yet, we can't identify exactly what the crime is. We don't necessarily have a murder weapon. The evidence is very difficult to pin down. The crime scene is very difficult to pin down. So it's incredible, but instead of the due process, what we got, and what so often happens, and we'll speak about that tonight, is we got an inquiry in lieu of the normal criminal justice proceedings and due process. And that's something we're going to talk about. And based on what's being presented tonight, we will demonstrate that what has been presented as the official story, in some cases, it is very possible that some of the facts have actually been falsified. And we'll show you why we believe that is the case. And that it's possible, very possible, that a chemical was likely planted to look like it was a Russian chemical attack. Again, these are only a hypothesis, only theories on our part based on what is publicly known, much like the official story. And that a victim was produced months after the fact. So Dawn Sturgess, and the inquiry and the report was just released last week. And also I think it's appropriate now, just out of respect to Dawn Sturgess and her family, that we acknowledge that and give a moment of silence in memory of her and what she and her family's been through. So we will demonstrate some of these things, and I think it's also important to say from the onset that, and as the title of this talk shows, we don't actually know what happened. Maybe somebody does, but we, as members of the public, as journalists, we actually don't know. And I don't think anybody really knows in the public, certainly not in the media, based on the reporting we've seen. But we can tell you with a high degree of likelihood what didn't happen. What didn't happen. And as a journalist, and I will humbly speak for my colleagues, that is what we should be doing as journalists and also as inquisitive members of the public, is that we're here to interrogate the official story and to challenge the facts and see if they hold up to scrutiny. That's the best we can do. And I think, my colleagues will share some of their insights and findings with you. So I want to get an opening statement from Craig Murray, and then we're going to hear a presentation from Tim Norman, which he's going to show us, audiovisual presentation. And then we'll have a Q&A session afterwards, and we really, really hope that a lot of you will be able to engage with us in the question and answer session afterwards. But Craig, go ahead.
Thursday night. I'm actually going to give my substantive talk after Tim, if that's okay. But I'd just like to make a few opening points, which is we're going to ask you to believe that the British government may be lying to you. Now, I can see that for some of you that's not a large reach to expect you to believe that. For some people it is, and we are aware that what happened in Salisbury had a profound effect on the community here. It disrupted lives, it disrupted businesses, it probably terminated some businesses, and that necessarily involves a certain amount of cognitive dissonance in being told that the official explanation of what disrupted your lives is not true. And just at the start, I'd just like to tell you a couple of things. First one was, I was a British ambassador. I blew the whistle on torture and extraordinary rendition. While I was ambassador in Uzbekistan, I stumbled upon, literally, the torture and extraordinary rendition program. We were sending people to Uzbekistan, at least the Americans were, in order for them to be tortured, often tortured to death, for us to get the intelligence. I blew the whistle on that. The British government denied it happened. Subsequently, there were investigations by the Joint Parliamentary Committee on Human Rights, by the Joint Parliamentary Committee on Intelligence, by the European Union, by the Council of Europe. I gave evidence to all of those, and subsequently it was proven, and nobody now denies that what I said was true. But initially, the government denied it. Jack Straw straight out lied to the Houses of Parliament. I also, as it happens, used at an earlier stage in my career to be the head of the FCO section of the Embargo Surveillance Centre, which was a multi-departmental and agency organisation which monitored the arms embargo on Iraq. And I knew for a fact there were no Iraqi weapons of mass destruction, and I knew for certain that the people who signed off on the dossier on Iraqi weapons of mass destruction knew that it was a lie. It wasn't an accident or a mistake. They knew they were lying. So I just want you to put aside any cognitive dissonance that the government will lie, and will lie in life and death situations. We know the government can lie, and I want you to consider that what happened here in Salisbury, you may have been lied to about systematically by the government. And I want to just add to that. Some of you may be aware that not many years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, a cache of papers were leaked relating to an organisation called the Institute of Statecraft. And the Institute of Statecraft ran, funded by the Foreign Office, which really means by MI6, something called the Integrity Initiative. And the Integrity Initiative, which is an ironic name, paid journalists around the world to write stories favourable to the Foreign Office. It was a propaganda operation in which journalists were paid to produce the British government line. And the amongst the journalists who were part of the Integrity Initiative was a gentleman called Dan Caschetta. And in the early days, when the Skripal story first came out, Dan Caschetta was very much quoted all over the papers and wrote a series of articles on Novichok and how this was definitely Russian Novichok. And I recall one he wrote, for example, which explained that the Skripals did not die because Novichok is degraded by rain, and it was raining that day, and that was why the Novichok was not fatal. That was one of Dan Caschetta's articles. Well, Dan Caschetta was paid to write that by the Foreign Office as part of the Integrity Initiative. And the Integrity Initiative actually had a Skripal group in their papers, and that Skripal group included Pablo Miller, by name, the MI6 operative here in Salisbury, who was Skripal's minder, who was the subject of a D-notice to prevent him appearing in any media. He was a member of the Integrity Initiative group, as was the BBC, as was the MOD, as was the FCO, and as was Porton Down. They were all part of this propaganda organisation. The government doesn't set up paid propaganda organisations in order to tell you the truth. Remember that. And remember that as you listen to Tim, and I'll speak to you again a bit later. Thank you.
I don't have anything like the illustrious background of Craig Murray. I'm just a local journalist who did about 10 years at the Brighton Argus. So I understand a bit about how local communities feel, how events can impact communities. That's really enough about my background, except as Patrick says, I've taken a great interest in this case. I can't tell you exactly why, except maybe it's just that feeling that you think you're being lied to, possibly, and it irritates you, when you get that feeling you're being lied to. It's not good. So I've taken the liberty of adding Dawn Sturgess' name to this title because the first thing I really want to do is pay tribute, and we have done, rightly so, to the family of Dawn Sturgess. It's their determination to find out what happened to Dawn and how she came to die that's brought us here to talk to you. The inquiry into Dawn's death and how it relates to the poisoning of Sergei and Yulia Skripal was entirely the result of the family's pressure on the government to get some answers about how she came to die in July 2018. And because we're here in Salisbury, there may be people who know the Sturgess family. So I think I can speak for everyone here, three of us, and everyone, that none of this, is intended to downplay her death. We extend our condolences to the Sturgess family. We really do. We want answers to the questions that the Sturgess family had, just like they do. Well, there she is. And listening to the conclusions of the Dawn Sturgess Inquiry last week, you could be forgiven for thinking the government established the inquiry because it wanted the truth about what happened to Dawn, and we want to be as transparent as possible. That isn't what happened, and that's the first of the 7 points I'm going to make about what didn't happen when it came to the events surrounding the Skripals and Dawn Sturgess and this nerve agent that we're calling Novichok. So, The UK government didn't want to hold the Dawn Sturgess Inquiry. If the UK government had its way, the inquest into Dawn's death would have been very limited and would have concluded years ago. The senior Wiltshire coroner, he's called David Ridley at the time, ruled in December 2019 that he would not examine the question of Russian state culpability for Dawn's death, or where the Novichok that apparently killed her came from, even though the UK government had said the poison was brought from Russia to Salisbury and discarded here by two Russian assassins who were on a mission to kill the former Russian spy, Sergei Skripal. The Sturgess family, very courageously in my view, challenged Coroner Ridley's ruling and took their case to the High Court, represented by the barrister Michael Mansfield. They won their case, and it was because of their legal victory that the inquest into Dawn's death was converted into a public inquiry. So unlike a coroner's inquest, a public inquiry can hear evidence in secret. The coroner is also typically replaced by a judge or a retired judge. This is what happened in the Hutton inquiry into the death of David Kelly, for example. And in the case of Dawn Sturgess, the Wiltshire coroner was ultimately replaced by a retired judge called Lord Anthony Hughes. When the inquiry into Dawn's death was established in 2022, the Home Secretary at the time issued a restriction notice to make sure the Sturgess family would not be able to see certain evidence. As well as eventually holding public hearings at the end of last year, the inquiry went on to hold closed sessions in secret, sessions that not even the Sturgess family lawyers, like Michael Mansfield, was allowed to take part in. So that's how transparent the inquiry was from the point of view of the Sturgess family. Charlie Rowley didn't appear at the Dawn Sturgess inquiry. I'm sure many people here are familiar with the mainstream narrative of what happened to Dawn. The Novichok that the two Russians brought to Salisbury was in a container disguised as a perfume bottle. After using the bottle to contaminate Sergei Skripal's front door, the Russians discarded it in Salisbury, where it was found by Dawn's partner, Charlie Rowley. He gave her the bottle, believing it really was perfume, and she used it to unwittingly spray herself with nerve agent, leading to her death. The problem with this narrative is it is entirely Charlie Rowley's account. He is the sole witness to what happened to Dawn and the sequence of events that led to her death. But he was not required to give evidence before the inquiry. He was said to be too unwell to do so. Specifically, he was said to be too drunk. In the final report, Lord Hughes writes, Charlie Rowley was wholly unfit to be called and would not be able to give oral evidence. For example, in his interview with the reporting doctor, had to be cut short due to him being severely under the influence of alcohol. So excusing the key witness from giving oral testimony in an inquiry of this importance because he was drunk, in my opinion, is not acceptable. Now, Lord Hughes admitted that Charlie Rowley's account of how he came to be in the possession of the bottle of Novichok was fraught with inconsistency, uncertainty, and unreliability. But he accepted the basics of his story nonetheless. Rowley was not only an alcoholic, but he was also a heroin addict with convictions for drug dealing and fraud. It should be noted that both Dawn and Charlie were initially believed by the police to have taken an opiate overdose, partly because Charlie's previous girlfriend had died of an opiate overdose in his presence almost exactly 2 years before. Rowley said he had absolutely no memory of finding the bottle that apparently killed Dawn. Here he is being interviewed by ITV News on the 24th of July 2018, which is just 4 days after being discharged from a 3-week stay in hospital.
It is very vague as to where I found it, as to when I found it. I believe it may have been in the Salisbury area, possibly Amesbury, I'm not sure.
However, he did remember clearly that the bottle was boxed and sealed in plastic, with the pump dispenser separate from the bottle, and he said he spilled some of the liquid on his hands while assembling it.
A half-inch thick, which contained a glass bottle, so you had to remove the bottle from the cellophane wrapper, put the pump dispenser on the bottle, and it poured. I ended up tipping some of my hands, but I washed it off under the tap.
Charlie Rowley is far from being the only important witness who didn't appear before the inquiry. Sergei and Yulia Skripal didn't appear. Lord Hughes ruled it would be too dangerous for them to appear to give oral evidence, even by secure video link. However, 7 years previously, Yulia was able to give a statement on camera without such concerns. Dawn didn't spray herself with Novichok. If we're to believe the generally accepted narrative of what Rowley said Dawn did with the bottle he gave her, you might think she did something like this. It's just water. And that's what the final report says. Lord Hughes writes, accepting Charlie Rowley's account, Dawn Sturgess sprayed the contents on herself, rubbing it into her wrists. However, the cap on the bottle was not a misting atomizer cap like this one. If it had been, spraying an atomized mist of nerve agent onto Skripal's front door would certainly have killed the two Russians as they did so, unless they were wearing full hazmat suits of the kind that became so familiar to people of Salisbury in the weeks that followed. Even though it says that Dawn sprayed herself with liquid in the bottle, the final report also states the liquid in the bottle was fairly viscous, and the pump dispenser was not an atomizer cap, but of a kind used in connection with pharmaceutical products. This is a picture of the bottle and its pump dispenser, which Neil Basu, the Assistant Commissioner for Counter-Terrorism Policing at the Metropolitan Police, who oversaw the investigation into the Salisbury poisonings, described as the perfect delivery method for the attack against Skripal's front door. And the contents of the bottle were said to potentially kill thousands of people. This is a picture of a throat spray manufactured in the Czech Republic under license from an Israeli big pharma company called Teva. Here they are side by side. Dawn didn't have Novichok in her blood. One of the most significant revelations of the Dawn Sturgess Inquiry relates to the fact that no sign of Novichok poisoning was found in her blood samples. These samples were taken after Dawn was admitted to hospital and sent to an extremely well-equipped NHS laboratory in Birmingham, which specialises in toxicology analysis. Among other things, Dawn's samples would have been analysed for evidence of an organophosphate, which is a class of chemicals that can be anything from pesticides to extremely deadly nerve agents like sarin and VX. This specialist laboratory in Birmingham found no evidence of an organophosphate in Dawn's samples. Not only this, but an anonymous DSTL Porton Down scientist, who was only codenamed FT49 by the inquiry, told the inquiry he anticipated that the laboratory in Birmingham would find no evidence of organophosphate in Dawn's samples. For this reason, he asked Salisbury Hospital to give him a split of Dawn's samples at the same time as they were sent to Birmingham so they could be separately analysed at Porton Down. In an attempt to preempt an unexpected failure to identify the organophosphate compounds by Birmingham's analytical laboratory, I suggested to Dr. Jukes, who's one of the ICU consultants at Salisbury Hospital, that DSTL should also receive a blood sample. FT49 wrote in a witness statement, late morning of 2nd of July 2018, I was made aware via a phone call from the ITU that the Birmingham results were back. There was no evidence of a pesticide or organophosphate. A statement to the inquiry from the Home Office pathologist Guy Rutty, who carried out the post-mortem on Dawn's body, confirmed there was no Novichok in her blood, although low levels were found on the skin of her wrists and neck. The reason for this, he suggested, was because all the Novichok in her system had by then bound to the tissue in her body and was no longer in circulation. The samples that FT49 took to DSTL Portland Down for analysis, which included tissue samples, did apparently show evidence of free, unbound nerve agent. However, Portland Down said the methods it had used to identify an organophosphate in Dawn's samples, when the most well-equipped toxicology lab in the country had failed to do so, were developmental, and that DSTL had not undertaken analysis of human tissue samples previously. Here is the list of the drugs that the Birmingham laboratory did identify in Dawn's samples, including the antidepressant mirtazapine and the sedative zopiclone, which can be extremely dangerous when combined with alcohol. The powerful opiate fentanyl was also found to be present. For some reason, the levels at which most of these drugs were found in Dawn's samples was not communicated to the pathologist. But he said he thought the fentanyl was given to Dawn after she was admitted to hospital. Julia's Blink interview was ignored. Another very significant revelation that emerged from the Dawn Sturgess Inquiry came during the testimony of Dr. Stephen Cockcroft. Dr. Cockcroft is the highly experienced ICU consultant who was on duty at the Salisbury Hospital when the Skripals were admitted. Strangely, the inquiry chose not to ask him how the Skripals presented when they arrived, instead directing those questions at Dr. James Haslam, a different ICU consultant who was not there at the time, but took over exclusive responsibility for the Skripals the following day. Haslam said, Sergei and Yulia were both extremely ill on their arrival at hospital, and they were both sedated and put on ventilation machines with tubes in their mouths. Dr. Cockcroft remained on the ICU looking after the other patients, but he found himself called to Julia's bedside by the ICU nurses just 4 days later. Dr. Haslam had ordered what is called a sedation hold for Julia, meaning that he wanted to reduce Julia's sedation to see if she would show any signs of life. This is commonly done on ICUs and patients who are on ventilation and can be done daily or even more frequently. When Julia's sedation was reduced, she didn't just show signs of life. She completely woke up. The nurses were unable to locate Dr. Haslam on the ICU when this happened. And so they summoned Dr. Cockcroft instead. Dr. Cockcroft found Julia in a state of panic, trying to pull the various lines out of her arms and attempting to get out of bed, still with a ventilation tube in her mouth. By this time, the doctors at the ICU had been informed that tests at the STL Portland Down had shown Sergei and Julia to have been exposed to a nerve agent, and because of this, Dr. Cockcroft had fully expected Julia to have suffered catastrophic brain injury. Instead, as he told the inquiry, he was gobsmacked to find she was neurologically intact.
I'll be honest with you, I was actually gobsmacked. This was a girl I never thought I'd see move again. I never thought she'd be capable of having a conversation. I was quite convinced she'd suffered catastrophic brain damage. And I couldn't believe that she could be as neurologically intact as she obviously was. She was looking at me, she was nodding, she was crying. She looked absolutely terrified.
But Dr. Cockcroft's testimony didn't stop there. He had clearly been speculating, at least to himself, as to how two people as physiologically different as Sergei and Julia Skripal could have been affected by a poison at almost exactly the same time. The Skripals had been discovered together on a bench in the Maltings shopping area here in Salisbury and had seemingly become rapidly incapacitated together in such a way that neither was able to call out to passers-by for assistance. That's CCTV that was released to the inquiry. Dr. Cockcroft had evidently decided there was a possibility they had been sprayed with something. It's also clear that Dr. Cockcroft had been informed, possibly by the police, of what Yulia and Sergei's movements had been in the hours before their collapse. While the ICU nurses re-established Yulia's sedations, Dr. Cockcroft sought to reassure her and explain what the hospital believed had happened. As an experienced ICU consultant, he was used to communicating with patients who were on ventilation by asking them to blink yes or no to his questions as they were unable to speak. This is what he did with Yulia. And these were the responses that she made according to notes that were taken by another doctor who was present. Do you remember what happened? Blinked yes. Did you take anything at home? Blinked no. Do you remember being poisoned? Blinked yes. Do you remember being sprayed? Blinked yes. Were you sprayed at home? Blinked no. Were you sprayed in the restaurant? Blinked yes. Do you know the person who sprayed you? On this cliffhanger, Yulia is said to have slipped back into unconsciousness, and there was no report of Yulia being given any further sedation holds until she was released from hospital on the 9th of April 2018, about 4.5 weeks later. After her discharge, she released a statement saying that she had been in a coma for 20 days. The consequences for Dr. Cockcroft in carrying out the Blink interview were severe. When the medical director of Salisbury Hospital at the time, Dr. Christine Blanchard, heard about what had happened, she immediately removed Dr. Cockcroft from the ICU rota and told him that he would be charged with professional misconduct if he spoke to any of his colleagues about what had happened. He was allowed to return to the ICU after both Sergei and Yulia had been discharged, but he resigned from the hospital 6 months later, ending his 25-year career as an ICU consultant there. In his final report for the Dawn Sturgess Inquiry, Lord Hughes wrote that Dr. Cockcroft's questioning of Yulia was clearly inappropriate, adding that the exchange provided no reliable evidence at all about how she was apparently exposed to Novichok. The fact she was coming round from sedative drugs meant her Blink interview had to be disregarded, which is interesting when you compare it to the inquiry's willingness to accept Charlie Rowley's testimony about the bottle. DSTL didn't get its batch results verified by the OPCW. Now, this may seem a technical point, but it goes to the heart of the role of Port and Down in what happened to the Skripals and Dawn Sturgess. When the fake perfume bottle was discovered by police in the kitchen of Charlie Rowley's flat on Wednesday the 11th of July 2018, which was 11 days after Dawn collapsed there and 3 days after she died in hospital when the decision was made to turn off her life support. There was a scientific effort to see if the Novichok samples from Skripal's front door could be matched with the Novichok from the bottle. More than the fact that the poison in both cases was said to be Novichok, the question was whether or not the Novichok in both incidents could be shown to have been produced at the same time and the same place, that is, from the same batch. Linking the substances at Salisbury and Amesbury in this way, establishing if they had the same chemical signature in the minute impurities that would have been introduced when the poison was manufactured, would be hugely significant for the investigation. It would provide a clear connection between the two incidents. On the 13th of July, The Guardian published an article headlined "Novichok that killed woman came from bottle, police believe," in which the reporter Stephen Morris wrote, "Chemical weapons experts from Porton Down were testing the substance to see if it was the same batch as used in Britain 4 months earlier, a finding that carries huge diplomatic implications." A batch match would have been a kind of smoking gun. It would present irrefutable scientific proof of a single, continuous, state-level operation that linked the poisoning of Sergei and Yulia Skripal with the death of Dawn Sturgess. So in order to carry out this important analysis task, a team from the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, or the OPCW, was given samples taken from the bottle to compare with samples taken from Skripal's door. The OPCW is the world's chemical weapons watchdog, and the laboratories it uses are the best in the world. OPCW labs have to submit to a constant process of evaluation to maintain their accreditation, and there are only 33 of them around the world. To carry out this kind of batch analysis, the OPCW will typically choose 2 of its accredited labs to each analyse the samples in secret. Their results are then returned to the OPCW and compared in a double-blind system that is scientifically robust. When the OPCW published its results on 4th of September 2018, anyone who had believed that the Salisbury and Amesbury Novichok samples would be definitively shown to be from the same batch would have been disappointed. Due to the unknown storage conditions of the small bottle found in the house of Mr. Rowley, and the fact the environmental samples analysed in relation to the poisoning of Sergei and Yulia Skripal were exposed to the environment and moisture, the impurity profiles of the samples available to the OPCW do not make it possible to draw conclusions as to whether the samples are from the same synthesis batch, the OPCW said. However, this wasn't the end of the story. At the Dawn Sturgess Inquiry, 6 years later, the anonymous Porton Down scientist, codenamed NK26, claimed that Porton Down had kept on trying to match the Salisbury and Amesbury samples after the OPCW had said this was impossible, and had eventually succeeded in doing so. MK26 told the inquiry he was unable to go into detail about how Porton Down had achieved this feat, although he was willing to go into detail in secret sessions behind closed doors. Lord Hughes used deceptive language when he describes this critical development in the final report. Although OPCW laboratories did not attempt definitive batch analysis, subsequent further testing in the UK was able to establish that the samples from the 2 events were highly likely to be from the same batch, he wrote. This is simply untrue. The OPCW had attempted to match the Salisbury and Amesbury batches, and it had clearly reported that its laboratories had not been able to make this link. As with the case of the fully equipped Birmingham NHS toxicology lab that couldn't find Novichok in Dawn's blood, while Porton Down apparently could, Porton Down had once again been able to achieve something that the best laboratories elsewhere had been unable to do. As an OPCW accredited lab itself, Porton Down should have immediately reported this critical breakthrough to the OPCW for independent verification. But there's no suggestion that this happened, and Lord Hughes accepted the idea that a UK lab alone, working off the books and to an indeterminate time frame, had achieved a definitive match where other OPCW labs had failed. Ducks weren't killed, and boys weren't injured. My final point may seem trivial, but it shows how the Salisbury-Novichok narrative has been used as a powerful propaganda on the world stage and shaped international political events. Sergei and Yulia were supposedly exposed to Novichok as they left Skripal's house, both touching the contaminated front door handle as they went out. They then drove to Salisbury, and one of the first things they did after parking at Sainsbury's was feed ducks on the River Avon with some local boys. CCTV pictures of this were released to the Dawn Sturgess Inquiry. Although the boys were given pieces of bread to feed to the ducks from the Skripal's contaminated hands, neither the ducks nor the boys suffered injury. However, the President of the United States was told and shown something quite different. According to the New York Times, British intelligence informed US counterparts that Novichok had killed ducks and injured children in Salisbury, and provided the then Deputy Director of the CIA, Gina Haspel, photographic evidence of the collateral damage caused by the assassination attempt. Miss Haspel showed pictures to the British government showed pictures the British government had supplied to her of young children hospitalised after being sickened by the Novichok nerve agent that poisoned the Skripals. She then showed a photograph of ducks that British officials had said were inadvertently killed by the sloppy work of the Russian operatives, the New York Times wrote. These photographs were used by Haspel to persuade then-President Trump to expel 60 Russian diplomats from the USA as part of a coordinated international response to the attack. Mr. Trump fixated on the pictures of the sickened children and the dead ducks, the New York Times reported. Trump approved the expulsions, which included closing down the Russian consulate in Seattle, and the USA ended up expelling more Russian diplomats than any other nation. But 3 days after the New York Times story appeared, Tracy Danchovich, then Director of Public Health at Wiltshire Council, responded in The Guardian with a statement that no wildlife were impacted by the incident and no children were exposed or became ill. It seems that the photographs the British government had supplied to the CIA were not real. On 5th of June 2019, the New York Times issued a correction to its story, confirming the photographs Haspel had shown to Trump were not from the Salisbury incident. Ms. Haspel displayed pictures illustrating the consequences of nerve agents attacks, not images specific to the chemical attack in Britain, the New York Times correction stated. The author of the article, Julian Barnes, also issued a correction on Twitter. There are, so far as we know, no pictures of dead ducks or sickened kids. Haspel did show pictures to Trump, but they were about the effects of nerve agents in general, and they were not specific to the attack in the UK. The New York Times correction about the photographs shown to the President is surreal. It suggests that to sell the most severe diplomatic action against Russia since the Cold War, the British government supplied the CIA, and the CIA then showed the President of the United States propaganda illustrating a hypothetical terror scenario. This intentional use of fabricated emotional imagery rather than verifiable facts shows the intelligence apparatus recognised it could manipulate the President's emotions to secure a desired geopolitical outcome. Out of all the things that didn't happen in the story of the Skripals, Novichok, the tragic death of Dawn Sturgess, and however easy you may think it is to do, there's the one thing we know did happen. The President of the United States was tricked. Well, maybe we all were.
That's a fantastic presentation. Thank you, Tim. And Tim has also authored a substantial piece on this called The Day of Skripal, which is published at the ukcolumn.org. Very lengthy analysis, as well as other work and interviews that he's done. I encourage people to go watch those, including the ones we've done recently. And also, I want to make this point before I go to Craig Murray. And at this point, based on what you've seen, these are quite compelling questions. Now, the people who would disagree with Tim's presentation, or people who are accepting the public inquiry's conclusions, when presented with something like what Tim has presented, would say, well, what happened then? And I just want to reiterate, they will say, do you have an alternative conspiracy theory or an alternative hypothesis? And if you can't tell me, what's a viable alternative theory, then you have to accept the official story. Otherwise, you're just a crazy conspiracy theorist. And I will say, and I've said this before, it's an important point, that the burden of proof is on the person or party making a positive claim. In this case, it's the government inquiry or the mainstream media. The burden of proof is not on me or you or any member of the public or a journalist to come up with a ironclad alternative scenario. No, the burden of proof is on the party or person making the positive claim. And that's all we are doing here. We're interrogating the official conclusions or what's presented as evidence from, in this case, the state, and also the mainstream media reporting on this. And so it's really important I make that point so that everybody knows where they stand in this debate, in this argument. And that's a point that's often, or it's never made in mainstream discourse when it comes to high profile, especially national security related stories, very emotive stories like this one. Just want to make that point. But I want to hand the microphone over to Craig Murray.
Thank you, Patrick. Yeah, and to perhaps just illustrate a point Patrick was making, if you said to me, oh, yesterday I went to Mars and picked up some rock samples and came back, I would say to you, no, you didn't. To say that, I wouldn't need to know what you were doing yesterday. I would just know you didn't go to Mars and pick up some rock samples. So I don't need to prove to you what happened in Salisbury in order to say that the official story could not have happened. Although I am actually going to throw out a couple of alternative hypotheses which I think are at least as believable and fit the facts at least as well as the official story, and I would argue rather better. You know, spy games happen. I had positive vetting for over 20 years in the Foreign Office. I worked very closely with the intelligence services. I worked very closely with MI6. We spy on the Russians, among other people. The Russians spy on us. Sergei Skripal was a defector, a former Russian intelligence service who had come here and worked closely with our intelligence services. People defect, people redefect, people can defect back. It's very hard to know who is doing what and why in the intelligence world. Something plainly happened in Salisbury that day, and let's see if we can dial down into what. Now, one thing I want to tell you, having been the target of Russian surveillance and attempted Russian recruitment and all the things that normally happen to senior British diplomats in the course of their career, the Russians are good. They have good intelligence services. They are effective. If any one of us was somebody that Putin wanted dead, I wouldn't sell you life insurance. I think the notion that they are incapable of carrying out a simple assassination is strange, and I want you to look at the simple story of how they carried this out. Remember, these are allegedly two senior, experienced GRU operatives with a long history of senior rank who have carried out many operations internationally, and yet you're asked to believe that they came here. Look at what you're asked to believe. You're asked to believe they came here to Salisbury in order to assassinate Sergei Skripal. You're asked to believe that they came here and did a recce the day before. How many of you know, can I just say, how many of you know the Skripal house? How many of you have been there? You know it? Well, it's really worthwhile to go and look. I hadn't seen it before yesterday, and I hadn't really taken on board, because none of the mainstream media really show it, how small the cul-de-sac is and how tightly packed with other houses the cul-de-sac is. It's about the size of this room, and there are 10 houses around it. And if you stand at the Skripal's front door, touching that doorknob, you are within 30 yards of 20 windows looking out at you. You really are. We went there to have a look and see. Within a minute of us being there, a lady had come out of a house and walked up a drive and stood there to see what we were doing. We could hear people coughing and talking inside the houses because they're those kind of modern houses. It is inconceivable. If you'd gone there and done a recce the day before, I can tell you, and I just have to ask you to trust me. You know, you are taught a certain amount of tradecraft when you're in the Foreign Office. No assassin is going to come there and see this small cul-de-sac surrounded by houses and think that is a perfectly safe place at noon on a Sunday morning in broad daylight to paint Novichok on the underside of the front door and nobody will see me. It's just not plausible. It's not. There were eyes looking on us as soon as we were walking into that cul-de-sac. And as I say, if you don't believe me, go and see it for yourselves. It's very, very overlooked. And it's just not what someone would do. On top of which, you're asked to believe this. You're asked to believe that coming to kill Sergei Skripal, the method they chose was to spray Novichok on the underside of the door handle. Now, there are two problems with that. Of course, you would do the underside because it might be seen on top and avoid it. But it's on the door handle. His daughter is also there. If two of you go out the door, how many of you normally touch the door handle to close it? One of you touches the door handle. You're giving yourself a 50% chance of killing the one you want to kill. That's not actually how a professional assassin works. And also, I don't know if you recall the alleged pump used, the perfume bottle that was shown, and I don't know if you noticed the ruler next to it, giving the measure, how many centimetres. That nozzle is 3 centimetres long. This is a nerve agent, which, if it touches your skin, you are going to die, we are told. I mean, it turns out turns out it didn't actually succeed in killing anyone. But, and I say that as well because, as I said, there was none in Dawn Sturgess's blood, and we should not forget that. You saw the list of things that were in her blood, which were enough to kill anyone, frankly. But there was no Novichok found in her blood by the NHS. I rule out Port and Dan because I simply don't believe them. But you've got this nerve agent, which, if it gets on your skin, will kill you, and you're putting it on the underside of a door handle through a pump action thing, and we know those kind of plastic things can leak, with a tube that long. And if any of it falls down, and the Russians do understand gravity, if any of it falls down on your skin, it is going to kill you. Now, not only that, the night before you do this, we are told, you are in Poplar in London, in a cheap hotel, where you are up all night drinking vodka, smoking cannabis, and entertaining a prostitute until the early hours of the morning, before you carry out an extremely delicate operation involving a nerve agent, which if you spill any of it, it's going to kill you. So of course you would drink vodka all night before just doing it, wouldn't you? And remember, the Russians are professional. They are not clowns. They are not stupid. That is not what a professional assassin would do. It just isn't. And on top of that, you then have to believe you have this pump action perfume bottle thing from which you have squirted Novichok onto the underside of the door handle. And if you believe Dan Caschetta and the stories the government initially put out, that Novichok degraded because it's raining, because of course you're Russian and you don't realise it rains in Salisbury. The chances of it raining in Salisbury would actually be pretty high. You haven't thought of that, apparently. You then take this bottle, and remember, you've squirted out the deadly poison through the cap and through that nozzle, which will then have dirty poison all in it. You then take it, according to the inquiry, to a public toilet, where you then take it apart. You take off the cap, which is full of deadly nerve agent. You have no protective gear. You don't have a hazmat suit. You don't even have gloves. You take this thing off, you pull out the tube from the nozzle, again, both full of deadly nerve agent, you repack them in a box, and then you take out, and this is the official story, your portable heat sealer. You take out your portable heat sealer and repackage the cellophane and put it all together again. Why? We went to that toilet. There are 4 dustbins just outside. Why not just chuck it in a dustbin? Why would you do that? What would be the purpose? And then, again, the extraordinary thing is, they went twice to the Skripals, and at this stage, you're the assassin. You believe this is apparently Novichok. And Novichok's meant to kill you in seconds. You know, you're meant to be dead. You're meant to be incapacitated in seconds, dead within 15 minutes. You believe you have sprayed this deadly nerve agent on the door. You don't know what time Sergei Skripal's coming out the door. He could have come out the door the minute after you left. You think you've just killed someone. You believe you have just committed a murder. So what do they do then? Do they head to the railway station? I mean, for one thing, if you're going to commit a murder, do you have as your escape plan that you'll get on the train on a Sunday? No. Again, the Russians are not stupid. Yeah, and you've done the poisoning of the handle allegedly. I don't believe it ever happened. You've done the poisoning of the handle allegedly somewhere where, if you did it, you are bound to be overlooked by the neighbouring houses. This guy's going to have collapsed shortly afterwards, dead on his driveway. The neighbours are going to be asked if anyone was seen. Police are going to be charging everywhere. And what are you doing? You are window shopping in Salisbury High Street. You're not even trying to lay low. You're walking down Fisherton Street, happily sauntering, looking in windows, missing one train, going back a bit later to the railway station, where you wait 40 minutes in the station cafe before getting on a train to London, and that's you at Waterloo. You then have to make a connection to the tube to get to Heathrow. So, you're a professional. It didn't occur to you to have a fast car waiting on the Devizes Road to whisk you straight to the airport. No, you thought, yeah, I'll murder him, then I'll wander around Salisbury for the day and do some sightseeing. This is not a credible story. It is obviously a mad story. Why? Why would you seal up? What were the Russians trying to achieve by sealing up into this perfume bottle, resealing with their portable heat sealer, and sticking it in a bin? Well, why were you doing that? If you were resealing it for safety, you could have just put it in some kind of easily tied plastic bag and chucked it in. It makes no sense. It asks us to believe in utterly clownish and incompetent Russian assassins carrying out an extraordinary plot and doing things for no good reason. And there are other impossible things we are asked then to believe. Tim has pointed out about the children handed bread from the Novichok covered hands, did not get injured. The ducks did not get injured. They went to the mill pub and they drank. The glasses they drank from were given back to the bar. They should have had Novichok on them. Yeah? Nobody was injured in the mill pub. Why? The whole story gives no evidence, bluntly, of there ever being any Novichok put on that door, or there ever being any Novichok on the Skripals. Let me give you some, and this is the killer for me. If you thought all that is absurd when you think about it, think of this. After poor Dawn Sturgess was taken ill, and after the police sealed off Charlie Rowley's flat, and they searched it. They searched it for 10 days, and they were looking for a small phial of liquid containing deadly Novichok. They knew they were looking for Novichok. That's what they were searching for. After 10 days, on the 11th day, they find a perfume bottle on the kitchen counter, which they couldn't find for the first 10 days. And when asked at the inquiry why they couldn't find it for the first 10 days, the police response was, it was hidden behind the washing up. So if ever the police come to search your house, if you have anything at all that you want to keep away from the police, I've actually got some stuff from Palestine Action in my house, but I'm hiding it behind a washing up because the police will never ever find it there. It's crazy. It took them 11 days to find a bottle of perfume on the kitchen counter. The answer is, of course, it wasn't there all 11 days. It was actually planted there later on. It's the only thing that actually makes any possible sense out of the story. And the unfortunately impaired Charlie Rowley, it was suggested to him. He found a perfume bottle. That's what I believe we have here. But you don't have to accept my alternative explanations to understand that the official explanation is mad. And as Tim briefly alluded to, if the official story was true, you have the Skripals touching their door, getting Novichok on their hands, and they're very different ages, and very different weights, and very different genders. And then for several hours, they happily go about their day. They're not feeling sick at all. They're feeling quite well enough to go for a pint in the mill. Then they're feeling quite well enough to go to Zizi's and eat a full meal, several courses, and wines. They're obviously not feeling sick. Then they come out having done that, and then suddenly, instantaneously, having been well enough to actually walk through the passage way there towards the Sainsbury's car park, suddenly they are both instantly incapacitated. And that bench, when you're on, people walk past it all the time. It's not an isolated area, but they are instantly, at the same moment, incapacitated, despite their totally different physiologies, in such a way that neither of them is able to ask anybody else for help. Again, it's nonsense. Can't you see it's nonsense? It just cannot be true. I said that I can offer alternative hypotheses. One alternative hypothesis I would offer you is conceivably Sergei Skripal wanted to defect back. Conceivably he wanted to go back to Russia. Or conceivably the Russians were trying to get him to go back to Russia. Conceivably Borisov and Petrov, whatever their real names were, came here to meet him, not to kill him. And conceivably the British wanted to thwart him going back. Because the one thing we know about Sergei Skripal now is wherever he is, he's under the control of the British state. The British state has him somewhere. Now that may be a benign control, or it may be a hostile control. We do not know which. But do not automatically assume it's a benign control. And that makes more sense. If they'd come to try to meet him, or maybe they had met him, maybe they talked with him, we don't know. We don't know what happened there. At several points, they were very close to them when both were in town. But that would explain why it could have been a covert meeting. Yeah, they came here to meet him without telling British intelligence services that was happening. They didn't want the British intelligence services to know they were going to take him back or trying to get him to come back. So that's secretive, it's not open, but it's not dangerous. You're not murdering anyone, you're not expecting to be arrested for it. So when you've done it, or if you didn't find him, or if you didn't want to meet, you can go window shopping and wander around and go home slowly on the train. That fits the facts much, much better. We have to not abandon the ability to think critically. And in this scenario, Dawn Sturgess died of all those other things you saw in her blood, which included cocaine, which included fentanyl, which she was given medically apparently, but it did include fentanyl. It included a great deal, according to Charlie Rowley, they had been drinking extremely heavily to the point they passed out the day before. And she had high levels of sleeping tablets and antidepressants in her bloodstream. I'm terribly sorry for the death of poor Dawn Sturgess, but you don't need Novichok to explain it. And the NHS couldn't find Novichok. But what it did was, because you may not remember this, or maybe you do, but actually after the Skripals didn't die, and after nobody had died, the government was actually having difficulty making the story stick. There was a great deal of skepticism in many places about the official story, including some European allies were saying that they'd seen no convincing evidence of a Novichok attack on the Skripals. The Sturgess death and making it part of the same story supercharged the story. It became a story not of Russians allegedly failing to murder one of their own agents. It became a story of Russians killing an innocent British civilian. I think the government seized on the unrelated and unfortunate death of Dawn Sturgess to plant this story. And that is my sincere and genuine belief. It is not my intention to offend anyone, but I've been inside the British government. I've seen the things the British government can do. And I believe that is what they are doing. Thank you very much.
In the interest of time, is everybody happy to go straight into a Q&A or take a 5-minute intermission to grab some refreshments, some tea and coffee, and meet us back in 5 minutes? Yeah, but before we do that, I want to ask Craig and Tim a question as well. And based on what Craig said, very important, Craig brought up the Integrity Initiative at the beginning. As a result of the Skripal affair, Theresa May was Prime Minister at the time, and at the G7 meeting, which was in Canada, I believe, in June of 2018, as a result of this story, Theresa May implemented a NATO-wide, G7-wide thing called the Rapid Response Mechanism, which mandates all member governments to be on the same page for any narrative that has to do with national security as a result of this story. And that plays directly into what Craig said about the Integrity Initiative effectively run by the Foreign Office and the other components of this in the United States and the other European, Germany, France, etc. It's all coordinated as a result of this story. That's how consequential this narrative is. But we actually still don't know exactly what happened. And Craig, just quickly, do you have any alternative hypothesis on where Sergei and Yulia are at the moment?
Well, I have my own sources within the intelligence services, and I was told a couple of years ago that they're in a place between Toronto and Niagara Falls. But I've never been able to find a second source to stand that up. That's a single source telling me that, but a well-placed source, and I've no reason to disbelieve it, but I only have that from one intelligence service source.
And Tim, you said something when we were out retracing the steps, which I thought was very, very compelling. Tim said, he turned to us and said, you know, all roads lead to Portendown on this story. And that just keeps popping up time and time again. And just very briefly, if you could, and then we'll take a quick refreshment break and come back for a good Q&A session. Explain it as briefly as you can, Tim, what you meant by that. And this insertion of BZ into the samples and why that's significant. But just go ahead, Tim.
Just briefly, that whole...
as brief as you can, but it's a very important detail. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, in the presentation, I hopefully alluded to the fact that I thought it's the authority of Portendown that we were leaning on very heavily, and they were moving away from getting independent verification from other OPCW labs. So we're just supposed to trust our own boys, basically. But that's not how science works, as we know. You have to have reproduction, you have to have verification. And that's what the purpose of the OPCW should be. So in the case of BZ that Patrick refers to, this was another OPCW lab that was charged in the initial case with testing the samples that had been given to the OPCW, verifying Portendown's claim that they had Novichok in these samples. And it was a lab called Spy's Lab, which is a little pun, because the Russians actually had a spy in Spy's Lab in Switzerland. And in a very unprecedented event, they revealed they had a spy in Spy's Lab in Switzerland. And Sergei Lavrov called a press conference and said, we know from our insider what's been found in the blood samples that's been given to Spies Lab, this OPCW lab. And they include sort of background levels of Novichok, an extremely high level of Novichok, which really should have struck the person dead, as we've been discussing. Not sure really what background level, but very significantly, evidence of a substance called BZ, which is a incapacitant, a kind of very powerful hallucinogen, almost like a kind of military-grade LSD, that causes the people not to die, but to start to suffer very immediate hallucinations. And that's interesting because the eyewitnesses and the Maltings who saw, particularly Sergei Skripal, in distress, said that there's a woman called Freya Church, who was one of the very first to see, said he was making strange hand gestures with his, and he was looking up to the sky, and then he became rigid and things of that nature. Meanwhile, the OPCW had to explain why they'd apparently found BZ in the samples that had been given, and the OPCW claimed that the precursors, at least of this substance, had been introduced as a control substance to test the labs involved to see if they could find this, possibly even more exotic than Novichok nerve agent. That's, as I say, a non-lethal incapacitant or hallucinogen. And that was actually the explanation that was offered for why the Russian spy had produced this sort of bit of explosive news, such that Sergei Lavrov felt it was suitable to blow the cover of his own spies within the OPCW.
And ironically, by inserting BZ, if that was the case, if there was BZ in the original sample, by contaminating or spoiling the evidence, you would then rule out the existence of BZ, ironically, in the original sample. So one could look at it from that point of view, and it does match the observations of Sergei Skripal. So using Occam's razor, that seems more probable than the official explanation. I just thought I'd thank you for that, Tim. It's one of many anomalies in this story. There's so many. Tim, you could have done not 7 points, but maybe a few dozen, probably on this case.
We can maybe talk about some of those after a little break.
Okay. Well, we're gonna let's take a break and reconvene in a few minutes. Okay, we're gonna start the Q&A in a minute, and we're gonna have a radio mic, which I'll go around the room and I'll try to. So raise your hand if you want to make a question or comment. I've got a few comments that we want to make before that. And when you ask your question, if you could, please keep it to a question rather than a long statement, just in the interest of time, because there might be quite a few people that might have some questions for Craig, Tim, or myself as well. If you do want to make a comment, I realize there are some people in the room that have actually written books on this topic. Nick is here as well. And the work of John Helmer it was very instructive for me as well. He's written 2 books on this as well, and Tim is working on a major literary project on this as well. But before we start, just a show of hands for the people in this room. When you arrived tonight, how many of you, when you arrived tonight, were kind of leaning towards the official explanation? If you want to, is there anybody in this room that was very brave of you to be? So we have a room full of, let's say, skeptics, critical thinkers, one could say as well. That's interesting. We did this presentation at a major UK festival, Beautiful Days, in Exeter. Over 20,000 people. In our tent, or the Rebel tent, there were over 200 people. And when we did the straw poll at the beginning, more than half of the tent believed the official story. And when we did the straw poll again at the end, after an hour and a half, more than half, about 70% of the tent raised their hands when I said, "Do you have questions now?" about the official story. And so from Tim's presentation and Craig's commentary on this, it has moved people's opinion on this. That's why I think this is a really important thing, and to have meetings like this. And it's also important to recognize there are many, many victims from this story. Not victims of Novichok. First and foremost, as mentioned, the community in Salisbury, and on so many different levels. Dawn Sturgess and the Sturgess family, what they've been through as a result of this story. Even Charlie Rowley is also a victim. In many ways, his life was transformed because of this story. Sergei and Yulia Skripal, we often forget. Where are they? We're not sure. Definitely I would class them as victims of the story, of this narrative. East-West relations, West, NATO versus Russia, that's a victim of this story. And if you think about the Ukraine war and the devastation in Ukraine, and we're talking about a massive loss of life on the military side, particularly on the Ukrainian military side, where they're conscripting soldiers at an alarming rate, where the average life expectancy on the front line in the trench is something like 48 hours. Okay? Now, the public support for this conflict in the West is predicated largely on stories like this. So this is not inconsequential. It's very, very consequential and very important. So I think we, one last thing, and then let's raise your hand for questions. Sergei Skripal had two pets, a guinea pig and a cat. 2 guinea pigs and a cat. And they weren't affected, right? By the Novichok, right?
Well, I mean, apparently the cat was a pedigree called Nash Van Drake, and it was a very loved cat. I think it had been sort of specially imported by Sergei Skripal. And not to forget these 2 guinea pigs. But yes, I mean, during the inquiry, Commander Murphy, the chief police witness who was being interviewed, they asked him about this cat, what was happening with the police are going in and out of the house, and what was the welfare of the pets like? And he just said, well, the cat got very distressed, and in the end, we had to euthanize it for its own welfare. Meanwhile, the guinea pigs died of thirst. And there was also a story, in fact, the vet, when he heard what had happened, who had been caring for this cat, immediately got in touch with the police and said, I'm concerned about the welfare of the cat. But somehow this message didn't get passed through. But nevertheless, we had police going in and out of that house. Indeed, in the early days, they didn't think the door was the source of this alleged poison. So they were using it quite freely, and yet they allowed the pets to sort of somehow waste away.
I think that veterinarian is in the room with us. Howard, if you tell us what happened then and what happened to the cat.
Yeah, is this working? Yeah. Is it working? Yeah. I was actually treating the cat at the time, and for those of you interested, I can tell you more about what it was like knowing Mr. Skripal. But at the time, I think I was concerned because I knew that the cat was due for a checkup, and I think, to be honest, it's difficult to know at a time like that just where your interests lie, because who would not be curious and who would not want to either get close to finding out what was going on, but equally, I did, be that as it may, I phoned the police and told them that I was concerned that the cat needed a repeat of its medication, and I was happy to look after the cat if that's what they wanted. and then also having known him personally for a few years at that stage, I can't honestly say. I'd have to go back and look at the records to see when I first met him. But I saw, because the cat had regular treatment, it was a chronic condition the cat had, and I got to know him as well as I suppose you could. He used to talk a lot to me about him traveling, about his son dying. I met his son. And so when he was in hospital, I was quite keen to see him. I didn't know how much family he had here, and so I went up to the hospital and was, as you'd expect, turned away. I then contacted the police again and told them exactly who I was and what I wanted. And at no stage did I have anything back from them. So, and then I heard that the cat had been put to sleep, and it wasn't the kind of cat that you'd expect would suffer particularly from such severe stress that it would need to be euthanized. I think that, you know.
Who euthanized the cat in the end?
I have no idea. I heard
Do we know?
I heard Porton Down, and yeah, it wasn't me. The cat was unusually calm, as cats go. Those of you who've got cats know what it's like to take them to the vet, and he would come. If I remember correctly, he always came by taxi, or he was driven there. And he insisted, he refused to have the cat in a basket. He would carry it in his arms. And then he would stand there stroking this big black Persian. And I just wish I could do his accent, which was Hollywood, I think was. And yeah. And we would talk. Yeah. So I like to think I got to know him quite well, but I obviously didn't get to know very much about him. And I treated his guinea pigs as well. I can't remember the name of the other one, but one of them was certainly called Lenny or Lennon. Yeah. Yeah. And Nash van Drake. I don't know where that came from or what that was about, but yeah, that was the cat's name.
Thank you, Howard. So, do we any hands up? Let me actually start in the back. Charles.
Charles Mallet, UK Column. Thank you very much indeed for an absolutely fascinating series of presentations, very, very well put together, and I am certainly somewhat the wiser for at least what didn't happen. Now, Craig in particular, you referred to it not being at all uncommon for people to defect or even go back the other way, and you know, this not being an uncommon scenario, and we are dealing with what didn't happen. Now, Patrick referred to what Theresa May set up that very summer, and you know, the consequences that are still felt now. The question that I have for any or all of you is, do you think, given his age and background, that Sergei Skripal was actually party to some information in particular that either the Russian state or the British state, or indeed another agency or actor, did not want to come out, either then or subsequently, and if so, what?
He certainly could have told them about the debriefing techniques they used with him after he defected. But of course, the most important thing he could have told them is what he told the British, because the British wouldn't know, and the Russians wouldn't know if he told them everything he knew, if he held some things back. I might say I myself became a whistleblower, for example, and when I blew the whistle on Torture and Extraordinary Rendition, I also at the same time told what I knew about WMD and the intelligence on WMD and what it did and did not say, for example. But there are some things which I know, which I learnt in the course of having my top secret classification, which I've never told because I view them as legitimate secrets. I think the British state had a legitimate reason for keeping those secrets. I haven't told everything I know. And it could well be that the Russians don't know what Skripal told the British of what he knows and what he didn't. Now that would be useful intelligence for them to get back, as well as I say, the debriefing techniques. And he will almost certainly have picked up the identity of several different MI6 agents during his debriefing. People, this is sometimes a deliberate, the double agent, triple agent is sometimes a deliberate blind where people pretend to defect. I don't think Skripal was this, but where people initially pretend to defect in order to get into the opposition intelligence service and then defect back as a deliberate thing. But I would say, and I kind of defer to those who knew Sergei Skripal, because I, of course, didn't know him at all. But he hadn't got a lot to stay here for. His wife had died, his son had died, his daughter was living back in Russia. He was very alone in the world. What did he have to stay here for? It seems to me, as he was approaching his later years, it seems to me very natural to think that he may have been getting homesick and thinking about could he do a deal to get back home to Russia, because what did he have here in his life? It must have been quite a lonely life, I think, in many ways. I'm not saying he didn't have friends, but he certainly didn't have family. His family were there. So I do think the defecting back scenario makes a good deal of sense.
Thank you. Let me start. This gentleman here, go ahead. Yeah, you've got it.
The idea that the Russians would kind of miniaturize a weapon of mass destruction in order to assassinate someone when there are much simpler ways of doing it, as the Jill Dando murder showed very well, seems daft. But then there's the murder of Litvinenko, and I just wondered, a one-word answer, are you skeptical about the account of the murder of Litvinenko, that he was killed with thorium, which I understand costs about $1 million a gram? Polarium, sorry.
What I would say about that is it was used, as it were, to create sort of not an assumption of innocence, but an assumption of guilt. So in the inquiry itself, they referred back to the Litvinenko case as if to establish there was precedent for the Russian state in acting in this way, to add credibility to what was supposedly done to Sergei Skripal. So irrespective, really, in a way, of whether or not the Litvinenko case was ordered by the Russian state, this isn't the way we're supposed to carry out justice in this. That's not, if you like, we're not supposed to slip to that level. We're supposed to evaluate the facts and the evidence on the ground and make our judgments not based on, that's of course how juries work. If a jury was prejudiced with information about somebody's who's been accused previous criminal record, that jury would have to be dismissed. So there's that. It was a sort of a deceptive thing to do, in a way, to introduce this sense of precedent and guilt to this story. And they did it quite freely. They couldn't have done it in a proper legal context. They can do it in the context of an inquiry that doesn't have those legal standards. But obviously, if it had been a proper court case, all of that would have been immediately thrown out by the judge. It wouldn't be allowed.
Craig, do you have a comment on that?
I should start with saying I've never closely looked into the Litvinenko case. It's not something I've closely investigated. So I'm going to stay fairly neutral on it. Other than if the official story in the Litvinenko case is true, it illustrates that Russia can do these things extremely efficiently and cleverly and well, if it's true. But whether I'd say it's just not a story I've ever investigated, so I can't tell you whether I think it's true or not.
I'll come to this side. I'm going to go to this side and then back again. Go ahead. Yep, this gentleman.
Okay, thanks for the talk. We feel privileged that you came here today to speak to Salisbury. It's gone dead, is it? No. Yeah. Thank you so much for coming to Salisbury. I just want to share a little bit and then give you the question. I was here when it happened, and I realised quickly that it was BS. And I had to, when we go shopping, we had to walk around a detour from the centre of town, and it was so frustrating. And I was there thinking, these bloody bastards, they've, closed the businesses, and we've got to walk all around the place thinking, yeah. So I just felt helpless. There was no one I could go to. There was no point in going to the MP because, etc. So it was like a helpless position that I felt in. And I'm sure, whoever realised at the time, second remark is that the World Cup was going to be on in Russia 3 months later. And, Russia is the home of chess strategy. So that was the one that got me, says, yeah, Putin is not stupid. So how would you know what I'm saying? 3 months before, bad publicity for, yeah. Anyway, my question is this, 20 years ago, we had David Kelly in the woods, and I met the guy who wrote the book, the MP from the Liberal Democrats who wrote the book about it. And then, of course, the government never, the government never owns up and says, sorry, we pulled a fast one on you. And they're never going to do it again, but is there, a certain amount of people found out about, realised about David Kelly, but has times changed? Is there more exposure of this now than there was then? That's the question. Does it make sense, the question?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I'll just chip in quickly on that one, just briefly, about the inquiry. There was a solicitor to the inquiry. There's a gentleman called Martin Smith, and he was a solicitor to the inquiry in the inquest into David Kelly's death. But he was 20 years later. He was the solicitor to the inquiry in the Dawn Sturgess case. So there's a kind of continuity, if you like, there. You might even say a sort of specialist lawyer. I would go further than that. He's also the solicitor to the inquiry into the COVID inquiry. And how about this? Baroness Hallett, who is obviously the chair of the COVID inquiry, was originally chosen to be the chair of the Dawn Sturgess Inquiry. She was taken from the Dawn Sturgess Inquiry to chair the COVID inquiry, but Martin Smith went to all three.
And I'll make a comment as well on this. It's great that you brought up David Kelly. Really important, because the end result of the inquest didn't happen as Tim said with this. It was rolled into an inquiry immediately, which is a completely different situation and process and transparency and so forth. But what happens at the end of the inquiry, final conclusion, or at least the one that makes the headlines, is, and you see this time and time again, the institutional tendency towards concluding that there was not a cover-up, not a conspiracy, but a cock-up. Somebody made a mistake, we didn't do a good job, and lo and behold, with the Dawn Sturgess inquiry, the Times immediately preempted this earlier in the week, said that we are outraged that MI5 did not do enough to protect Sergei Skripal, leaving his house unguarded in this cul-de-sac and so forth. And this is a major cock-up by the security services. We must do better, we need more funding, we need more resources, etc. And this is time and time again, you see this, the media lean this way, the government will always lean that way, because it is the safest conclusion. And in that, you can just kind of dispense with the whole event and just kind of draw a line under it and move on and say, we'll do better next time, basically. And people have written books about the David Kelly the Hutton Inquiry as well, and have pointed out this. Many esteemed journalists have also pointed this out as well. So, again, we see it once again. So I find that extraordinary. Do you have any comment on that?
David Kelly, of course, takes us straight back to Porton Down again. You're saying all roads lead to Porton Down, and they most certainly do. I knew David Kelly very slightly. I did know him. I'd met him, and I'd been in meetings with him. It always seemed to me quite extraordinary that one of the UK's leading chemical weapons experts, if he were going to kill himself, would kill himself by digging out his veins with a penknife. That seemed to me, and I should say, it's an example though of helplessness, isn't it? That the difficulty is with David Kelly. I'm pretty sure you had a majority of the public who did not believe the David Kelly official story. I'm not actually sure I know anybody who believes the David Kelly official story. But we can do nothing about it. When it comes to it, when you're up against something done and enforced by the security services, and you're up against the state's ability to pack, public inquiries with some corrupt judge or lord, in fact, someone who's corrupt and a judge and a lord simultaneously, then our ability to really do anything about it is extremely constrained. I think this is where you come up against the limits of democracy, and you realise we don't actually live in a functioning democracy. We live in a kind of sham of democracy.
We've got one here, Gemma. Nick, go ahead.
Thanks. I was at the inquiry at the end of last year, for 5 weeks, and I was regarded as sort of tinfoil hat conspiracy theorist of not believing it. And I was very aware how all the people, about imagine 40 or so people in this huge room, lawyers and journalists, police, security agents, seemed to believe the official story. From my point of view, it was a lie, unfolding of a lie in enormous detail, but they didn't see it that way. I think that they somehow had a collective belief that what they were talking about was somehow true. And asking myself, how is that possible? I would say it's the shared enemy image that gives them that ability. Oh, the bad Russians would do that. You wouldn't question that, would you? Otherwise, you must be some agent of Putin. So I want to ask the panel, what's going on in the civil service with narrative like this, some sort of collectively shared illusion? Is that made possible by the enemy image? Would you see it that way at all?
Civil service, I think that would be Craig.
Yes, I think that's true. You convince yourselves that you're united against an enemy, and you are the good guys and they are the bad guys, and therefore it's patriotic and in the interests of the state to support the official narrative. But I want to add something onto this. I was talking earlier about Iraqi weapons of mass destruction and my time in the Foreign Office. There are two things I want to share. I was walking, when the day that the dossier on weapons of mass destruction, the famous dirty dossier, was published, I was walking down the corridor, and Bill Patey, Sir William Patey, who later became British ambassador to Iraq and British ambassador to Afghanistan, and at that time he was head of the Foreign Office's Middle Eastern department, Near East and North African department. He was one of the people who had to sign off the dossier, and I just passed him in the corridor. And we both went to Dundee University. I think we were the only people in the Foreign Office who went to Dundee University. So I stopped him and I said, Bill, it's not true, this stuff about Iraqi WMD, is it? Is there something I don't know? Is there something I missed? And he just laughed and said, of course not, Craig, it's bollocks, and just carried on walking down the corridor. So civil servants are able somehow to know they're lying and know it's not true and yet continue on the job. But also another person who I won't name because they're still in the Foreign Office, similar situation. I was talking to them, this is while I'm still in the Foreign Office, I was talking to them about it. And I said, how do you reconcile this? And we both played, we were both aficionados, we both played the video game Football Manager. And he said to me, Craig, you know when you're playing Football Manager, while you're playing, you are the manager of Manchester United or whichever team you're managing. While you're immersed in the game, you are that manager. You're playing the game, you are it. And you might play it for 4 hours, during which you are the manager of Manchester United. Then you switch off the game and stop. He said, and when I'm working, Iraq has weapons of mass destruction because that's the game I'm in. That's the role I'm playing. And then when I leave work and go home, of course I know Iraq doesn't have weapons of mass destruction. And that's another interesting glimpse into the psychology. And that's from someone who was in the heat of it. You know, people manage, when you saw them at the inquiry, that they had their official faces on and they believed it because they were in the game. Probably when they go home and have a cup of tea and talk to their mates or whatever, but they might well admit it's nonsense. I've often wondered about the psychology of because I came across things and couldn't put up with the lies, and I wasn't able to live a lie, basically, or put up with ghostly immoral things. Whereas other people I knew who were very nice people, they weren't bad people at all, they were lovely people, really good people, my close friends, I've worked there for over 20 years, they were prepared to sign off on lies and do things they knew to be wrong as part of the job. And I've spent half a lifetime trying to understand the psychology of that. And those are just a couple of insights I can offer.
I think we just coined a new term. It's the football manager syndrome. And the Foreign Office. You know, it brings it down to a human level. And thank you, Nick, for making that observation and Craig's comment, because then we really understand that, because we all work in companies and organizations, or we have in the past. And if you look at it from on that level, it's really, really helpful in getting some clarity that, yeah, it's possible, it happens, and that's why it happens. I think that's important. In the back, this gentleman here.
Okay, just asking, is Salisbury just a small part in a shift in the world order and a thirst for control of resources? Are the Skripals, patsies, the modus operandum that we see time and time again in a bigger game? Was the attack on Salisbury an attempt to falsely galvanise world opinion against Russia ahead of what had already been planned in Ukraine, possibly even before the Maidan coup? And was the goal only ever about weakening the Russian Federation while simultaneously asset stripping the mineral wealth of Ukraine, as verbalised by Republican Senator Lindsey Graham this year?
I think the answer to the last 4 points you made is probably emphatically yes. And without going into too much detail myself, you need to see this as part of a progression, part of a pattern. And I would even say I'm very skeptical about the assassination of Boris Nemtsov in Moscow. Who benefited most from that? Was it the West or was it Putin? And again, it falls into your question, is all of these things are setting up, strengthening the public acrimony in the West towards Russia. And I think it seems to be clear. And so it's important to look at it from, who benefits, qui bono, as they say in Latin. Do any of you have a comment on that?
I just want to pick up slightly on what Nick was saying about this sort of kind of groupthink, maybe effect that you was talking about having been personally attending the inquiry. And I wasn't personally there, but I was interested in the reporting. I mentioned this gentleman called Stephen Morris, who's the reporter for The Guardian, who's covered this story for a very long time. So when Craig was talking about, for example, the portable heat sealer story, which for me is a sort of apex of absurdity, or an apex of absurdity in this whole narrative, Stephen Morris repeated it, as it were, like a transcript, or a stenographer, as you might say, into his reporting in The Guardian. And at no point did he insert any editorialising or any kind of question into his reporting. He simply just repeated what he'd heard, and there are sort of lots of other examples like that. So there's another example where Sergei Skripal, when he's at the bench at the maltings, he's attended to by a paramedic called Carl Bulpit, and there was testimony given by Carl Bulpit, which was reported as if it was personal testimony. Oral testimony wasn't. It was written testimony that was quickly admitted into the proceedings at the end of the day, in which he said he thought that Sergei Skripal was suffering from an opiate overdose. That was the initial diagnosis. And so he spilled his drugs bag in the back of the ambulance, and he picked up what he thought was 2-PAM, in other words, treatment for opiate overdose. And unknowingly, he'd actually picked up a vial of atropine, which is a treatment for nerve agent poisoning. It's a form of, it's not an antidote as such, but it impedes the effects of nerve agent. And so, if you will, Sergei Skripal accidentally received the right drug from a paramedic who thought he was giving him a different drug. So that stretches credulity a bit, wouldn't you say? And once again, that was just repeated in the reporting by The Guardian, just in a very flat tone, without any hint of scepticism, because these people, I don't think, they can't go there, like we're saying. It's this sort of breaking the omerta, if you like, the unwritten rule, that you don't allow questions to enter into the reporting on these narratives.
And let me add to that, ask you as well, Tim, beyond just propaganda like this, at the time, I think it was Tom Tugendhat. Was he the head of the Defense Committee as an MP, conservative? Yeah. He made a claim about the death of Sergei Skripal's wife and son. Explain that, because that's quite extraordinary.
This was comments that he made very shortly after the event, so still in March 2018, and he suggested that Lyudmila Skripal, who died in 2012, had died the year before, 2017, and that she had been killed by the Russian state. And furthermore, that his son, Sasha, had also been killed by the Russian state. And it's very clear from the people who knew them, who gave testimony, his friends in Salisbury, that it was certainly true that Lyudmila had died of cancer. She was in fact suffering from cancer when she came from Russia to join Sergei here in Salisbury, and that his son was unfortunately a chronic alcoholic, and he was reported as being yellow when he came to visit. He had yellow skin and jaundice and so on. And Sergei took a very sort of philosophical attitude to his son's death. He felt he'd almost sort of deliberately killed himself through his sheer intake of alcohol. So it was a very cynical bit of propaganda to have come out with. Very vicious form of propaganda, really, to use the death of Sergei's wife and son as yet more supposed evidence that this is a malicious Kremlin plot.
Yeah, I mean, it's politicians so quick to not just run with the narrative, but embellish the narrative. It's amazing and shocking. Any other questions? Any hands? Truman?
Yeah, just quickly. Okay. The whole thing is full of holes, obviously. But the critical thing to me is who knows better. I mean, if the Russians had really tried to kill Skripal and his daughter, then they'd be very willing, to say the least, to expose that. Why has the government kept them incommunicado? That's the proof of the pudding.
Thank you. Yeah, I fully agree. Do you guys have any comment on that?
I mean, we have no evidence that they are alive and free. There is plainly no reason at all why they could not, by video link, have given evidence to the inquiry. Secure video link exists. They could have been taken into a British embassy in the country where they are and done it from there using the government secure encrypted communication system. There are many ways it could have been done, but there's no genuine security risk in them giving evidence via video link to the inquiry. And if they are alive and free, I would expect them to give evidence. And it really is extraordinary that nothing has been done whatsoever to give proof of life. We don't know if they are alive. And as I say, and we don't. If they are alive, we don't know if they are free or captive. We just don't know.
And there's one other point. Tim, when they were in the hospital, and when Yulia came out with her interview, she had a hole in her. They had a tracheotomy, right? Both Sergei and Yulia. But that wasn't given immediately, was it? The timing of that, just explain what happened. I think this is a really important detail. Go ahead.
This is a really rather dark little detour into what happened to Sergei and Yulia. I mean, I think we can imagine they're being held in sedation. We know that Yulia was, after all, she woke up after 4 days, as I mentioned. So from beyond that point, I would suggest she was being held in some sense against her will. At that point, she should have been on a program to recuperation, to having her ventilation removed and so on. But that didn't happen. And instead, it is true that after 2 or 3 weeks of being intubated, if you're chronically ill, you will have a tracheostomy put into your neck, so you're no longer breathing through your mouth. You're breathing through a surgical hole that's made in your neck. However, it just so happens that both Sergei and Yulia had their tracheostomies on the same time, the same weekend, which also happened to be the same weekend that the OPCW fact-finding team was coming to Salisbury Hospital to take blood samples from them, which were then going to be tested, as we mentioned, at labs like SPIES. So the rather gruesome implication is that they were physically prevented from being able to talk, even if they had wanted to, by having these tracheostomies put in. And in the case of Yulia, who, as we already know, was already fairly well, she only had this in for a matter of 6 days. And in fact, the inquiry does actually say that perhaps it was a little bit unnecessary in Yulia's case. But the point is, when the OPCW arrived to take samples, they were physically, in a very literal sense, prevented from being able to speak.
Thanks. This gentleman here.
Yes, I hadn't ever heard about the BZ part of this story. Firstly, how would the BZ actually be administered to them? They're sitting on this bench, apparently quite happy, and suddenly they go, could this whole thing be set up and they were actually acting this and then they were taken to the hospital? Because we know that these intervention medicine processes can actually, like tubation and ventilation, can actually kill you, etc. Was it all part of a complete act? Is that what was going on? Is that another theory as to... So I don't know how the BZ actually gets into those... How do they take the BZ? Is it in the food from their meal, or does someone walk by them? Do we know how that happens?
Yeah, you're asking theoretically how would they have been exposed?
Was it all an act, and then they were taken to the hospital, and then they were sedated and...
Is endless possibilities.
So how do you get the BZ in somebody?
In permutations, how would you administer a poison like that?
You know how the sort of very, very early reports in cases like this probably can be treated with a little bit more seriousness perhaps than the later ones where the narrative's been manipulated or massaged in some way. And so within 3 days, the Standard, for example, was saying there were fears that Sergei and Yulia had been sprayed. So, well, I mean, you have to ask yourself why, again, how could these two people who were of very different physiological condition have been overcome in a moment? And that's why I would suggest Dr. Cockcroft had thought for himself that perhaps a spray had been involved rather than dermal exposure, which clearly is going to take, a kind of... it's not a controlled way to... Well, yeah. And so there was a report in the Star after a couple of weeks that said MI5 fears that the Skripals have been poisoned by a mini drone that flew over their head and sprayed them, from above. And that's what... now, I realise that's quite an unlikely and bizarre scenario. But then when you kind of line that up against the idea they touched a door handle 3 or 4 hours before and then suddenly collapsed at the same time, you have to ask yourself, well, which is more or less probable of those two?
Thanks. Any others? Carol, go ahead. You have a question?
I have, yeah. Oh, okay. Sorry, your mic. I want to know, has anybody done the sums, done the maths on how much all of this has cost? Because we know how much the inquiries cost. But what about putting on this whole charade in Salisbury, the poisoning, the police effort, and which budget did it come out of? Does anybody know?
There's two different things. One is you're talking about the cost of the inquiry, and then the just general ancillary, regular running cost of law enforcement and so forth. That's one question. It's hard to quantify, but I remember we did this presentation before, and one of the people in the audience said, the amount of economic devastation to Salisbury, why would the government do that and put the city through such trauma and so forth? And I think Craig answered that question at the time, and there were people who were generally shocked by Craig's answer, but then it was a bit sobering as well. And Craig said, well, what makes you think the government cares about your community? It's geopolitical cannon fodder. If you look at the broader scheme of what's going on in the world with the United States, NATO, Europe, Russia, China, and so forth. And then, of course, from that point of view, it makes sense. But yeah, I don't have an exact answer to your original question, but thank you, Carol. This gentleman here in the orange jumper, there's a mic behind you.
Yeah. What it is, I think, that looking at the bigger picture into which this fits so neatly, is the drive, the very obvious drive now towards war with Russia. This is the issue which we're really talking about here, behind the details, which are very interesting to study, very interesting to hear what Tim and what Craig has to say. Craig too said something very interesting about the mindset of state officialdom. People who are superficially decent, normal human beings will completely go on side in their own minds as much as anything else with the state agenda, with an agenda like this, a wicked agenda, to produce a war. And things are coming together, I would suggest, at the moment, which are going to incline our so-called leaders, in inverted commas, to favour war. You've got the likes of, it's Patrick, you most of all, who can perhaps comment on this. You've got a situation now where Starmer has said we're not going to have any elections for the next 3 years or however long it is. Will we get any elections at all? Perhaps he's banking on something he knows, that war is going to be brought about between now and then. A very good year for it, which, as Nick would confirm, is numerologically, I think, sinister, would be 2027 to start it going. This I think is the frame into which this fits, the jigsaw puzzle in which this here and events and things like it are a part. Earlier on today, my wife and I saw your recent piece from last Friday, I think, a brief piece where you're expressing scepticism about Trump's motives in talking about peace and how substantial they are, probably totally insubstantial. As insubstantial as Woodrow Wilson's were in 1916 when he said no foreign wars, as FDR in 1940 when he said your boys are not going to be sent to foreign wars, happened in a year. And it would seems to me that we're on the brink now of a very serious situation. Perhaps you'd like to comment, Patrick.
I will, and I'll make a very convenient segue off of your Woodrow Wilson reference there. yes, Starmer, is he going to pull a Zelensky and suspend the democratic process? But Craig, on this point, prior to World War I, history tells us, many people commented, there was this inevitability that Europe was going to war, and it was a juggernaut and nobody could stop it. It was a fait accompli. That's how some historians and political commentators look back at that time. And we could say, I'm feeling the same, many of the same indicators right now, which I find to be quite shocking that we haven't learned those lessons. And that seems to be the most important lesson from World War I, or prior to World War I, is to be cognizant of that inevitability, and something that we would do well to avoid. Just from the historical perspective, Craig, based on what this gentleman said.
No, I think the parallel with the run-up to World War I is very apt, where you have a out-of-control arms race and a posturing towards each other, a whole series of events. I mean, we're seeing a 25% increase in UK defence expenditure, which is massive and which we can't afford. We're struggling to pay for other things in the state, and we're struggling with an over-high tax burden. We've got talk of, Starmer has actually said, we are on a war footing. We are harassing Russian ships going through the Straits of Dover. You know, Russian ships have absolutely every right in law to go through the Strait of Dover. They're doing nothing illegal whatsoever. How would we feel if Iran closed the Straits of Hormuz? Passage through straits is a fundamental part of international maritime law, and yet it's front page of the Daily Mail when Russian ships go through the straits and we buzz them illegally with planes. And it's extraordinary. You've got Germany getting people to sign up for conscription, saying that at the moment it's voluntary, but it may become compulsory. You've got the European Union led by nutters, frankly, who are absolute war hawks, and people like Callas and von der Leyen and the Finnish Prime Minister and the loonies in charge of NATO at the moment, Rutte. They're all gagging for war, and their talk is of war, and they use the word war. They say we must prepare for war. Well, how about preparing for peace? That seems to me a rather better plan, because we can't afford a major conflict in Europe. And I do think the Russophobia has become the acceptable racism. You can say as bad things as you want about Russian people, and that's okay. That's the racism which is respectable in our society. And yet Russia is a vital part of European culture. Things like Tolstoy and Chekhov are not incidental to European culture. They're fundamental building blocks of European culture. And Russia has no plans whatsoever to invade the UK, and never has had any plans to invade the UK. There's also this we're talking about it, there's this extraordinary schizophrenia in the Western position. You get the same people crowing and saying the Russian army is pathetic and weak and it can't even take Pokrovsk. And at the same time, the same people are saying, yet the Russian army is going to roll across Europe and it's going to take Warsaw, Berlin and Paris. Well, they can't both be true. But both positions are adopted simultaneously by the war hawks, which again just makes no sense. All of it is about asserting authoritarian control. They don't actually want a war. What they want to do is they want to increase defence expenditure, because defence expenditure is the most corrupt of all expenditure and is the best way for politicians and civil servants to enrich themselves. That's why they want to increase defence expenditure. And they want to increase the war rhetoric because that is what justifies all the new authoritarian legislation that's coming in, the Online Safety Act, the Public Order Act, digital ID cards, that whole thing of stripping the civil liberties away from a citizen. That's what it's actually about. It's about control of the state by a small, very powerful group of the ultra-wealthy, and ensuring there are no democratic outlets for the people to fight back against that. I'm sorry, that took us rather a long way away from the original subject of the meeting, but that's what is behind narratives like the Skripal narrative. I don't think this was a long-planned operation. I think this was an opportunistic reaction to a Russian plan to extract the Skripals, to which they reacted opportunistically to thwart it and saw the opportunity to turn it back on the Russians as an anti-Russian narrative. That's what I think happened here. And it's part of, you have to see it within this whole raft of anti-Russian propaganda designed to increase defense expenditure. I'm going to hand back to the chair. I don't want to take away the authority of the chair, but we have to finish.
Yes, and that's a great note to finish on. Thank you, Craig. Ladies and gentlemen, thank Craig Murray, Tim Norman. Do follow them if you can on social media, on X as well. Again, Craig's blog, craigmurray.org.uk, is really required reading, I think, for everybody, and his coverage of court cases, really important court cases, unrivaled, and he's doing a public service there to us and to the world, and also Tim as well is just doing Spartan work on this Skripal story, and I really appreciate it. Let's give them a big round of applause. So a round of applause to my colleagues at the UK column for helping to produce this event. Mike Robinson, Phil, Gemma, Charles as well. Big round of applause and a big thank you. And lastly, this is available on the live stream, and the recording will also be at ukcolumn.org, also probably on the video sharing platforms like YouTube later. Please, if you think you know people that are interested or maybe have questions about this, please share the material with them. That helps us a lot, and I think it goes a long way to raising public awareness. But again, Merry Christmas as well from all of us to all of you. Thank you for coming out, and take care. And we'll be able to say goodbye and whatever in the lobby here as we break down. But take care. Thank you very much, everybody.